Ada for arguing with my husband because he always spoils our daughter and undermines me? I honestly don't even know if I'm in the right here, but I feel like I'm slowly losing control in my own house, a place that should feel like a sanctuary, a space for balance and shared values. My husband and I have a 12-year-old daughter, Emma, and she's a good kid, truly. She's smart, funny, and curious, with a personality that lights up a room. But the way my husband treats her, the pedestal he places her on, is driving me to the brink of insanity. From the outside looking in, anyone would think Emma has the perfect life. She lives in a world where every whim is met, every desire fulfilled before it even becomes a fully formed thought in her mind. It's not just occasional treats or special occasions, it's an endless stream of indulgence. Every time a new phone is released, she's holding it in her hands within a week. It doesn't stop at phones. There are iPads, gaming consoles, top-of-the-line sneakers, and trendy clothes. If there's a must-have item on the market, chances are Emma already owns it. Sometimes, I swear, she doesn't even have the chance to dream about wanting something because my husband anticipates her desires like he's some kind of psychic. Half the time, she doesn't even ask for these things, he just buys them, convinced she'll like it. I've tried reasoning with him more times than I can count. We've had what feels like a million conversations about this, about how Emma needs to learn the value of money, about how constantly showering her with things isn't the way to raise a well-rounded child. But every single time, he brushes me off with a casual wave of his hand and says something like, "She's only young once," or, "I just want to see her happy." Those words haunt me because I understand the sentiment, but I can't shake the feeling that this approach is more harmful than it is kind. It's not just about the material things, though those are certainly part of the problem. It's the way he undermines me when it comes to parenting, and how he consistently overrides my decisions. It's the pattern that's forming, the precedent he's setting, and the message it sends to Emma. When I tell her to clean her room or put away her laundry, she whines, like any 12-year-old might. That's normal. But instead of backing me up, instead of reinforcing the importance of responsibility, my husband swoops in like a knight in shining armor and says, "Don't worry about it, sweetheart. I'll do it." And then he does. Last week, I walked into her room to find him picking up her clothes, making her bed, and organizing her desk while she sat on her bed, scrolling through TikTok, completely oblivious to how wrong this picture looked to me. I feel like I'm shouting into a void. Every time I try to address it, he dismisses me, his reasoning wrapped in sentimentality and the idea of creating a happy childhood for Emma. But where is the line between a happy childhood and one that sets her up for unrealistic expectations of life? Does he not see how this could snowball into something bigger? My words feel small compared to the giant gestures of love he demonstrates in his own way. And Emma, oh, Emma. She's caught in the middle, soaking in the attention, the love, the gifts, and the ease of it all. I've started to wonder if I'm the villain here, the one person standing in the way of their perfect father-daughter dynamic. But then I think about what happens when Emma grows up and faces the reality of the world, a world that doesn't hand you the latest iPhone just because you might like it, a world where people don't swoop in to clean your room or fix your mistakes. And that thought terrifies me. It keeps me up at night, replaying every argument, every instance of me standing firm only to be overridden. Am I the only one who sees where this path might lead? Or am I too rigid, too focused on teaching lessons and missing the beauty of letting a child simply be a child? The issue isn't just about the material possessions. It's the constant undermining of my role as a parent that chips away at the fragile foundation of balance I try so hard to maintain. It's a pattern, and it feels as though every decision I make, every lesson I try to teach, is met with resistance, not from Emma, though her defiance is often a side effect, but from my husband, who seems determined to be the good cop in every scenario. Take something as simple as chores, for instance. I've always believed that learning to take care of your own space is fundamental, a skill that's as much about discipline as it is about self-respect. When I tell Emma to clean her room, the reaction is predictable. She whines, she complains, She drags her feet, and I stand firm, knowing that this small act of responsibility is important. But then, like clockwork, my husband intervenes. It's as if he's been waiting in the wings for his moment to step in and play the hero. "Don't worry about it, sweetheart. I'll do it," he says with an indulgent smile, his words dripping with reassurance. And just like that, the lesson is lost. He literally cleaned her room last week, bending over to pick up her dirty laundry while she sat cross-legged on her bed, engrossed in TikToks as though she were royalty being served by a loyal attendant. It's not just frustrating, it's infuriating. I feel like I'm waging a war on two fronts, one against a 12-year-old's natural inclination to test boundaries and another against a grown man who refuses to see the damage he's doing. This isn't about me wanting to impose unnecessary rules or be a tyrant in my own home. It's about preparing Emma for the reality of life, a reality that doesn't come with a personal assistant to clean up your messes or shield you from the consequences of your actions. The culmination of all this came to a head last night, and the memory still burns fresh in my mind, a vivid tapestry of frustration and helplessness. Emma had a school project due, an assignment she had known about for weeks but had, predictably, left until the last possible moment. When I found out, I made it clear that this was her responsibility to fix. I told her she needed to stay up and finish it, even though she was whining about being tired. Her complaints of fatigue fell on deaf ears as I explained, yet again, the importance of time management and accountability. "You can't just expect things to happen for you," I said, my voice firm but not unkind. "This is your project, and you need to complete it." For a brief moment, I thought I had made my point. She reluctantly shuffled to her desk, her posture screaming irritation but her hands reaching for her supplies. But then, like a scene from a play I'd seen a dozen times before, my husband entered the room. His tone was light, almost conspiratorial, as though he were letting her in on some great secret. "It's fine," he said, his words slicing through the air like a blade. "She can finish it tomorrow morning." I stared at him, my mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words to counter his dismissal of everything I had just said. Before I could find my voice, he had already taken a seat beside Emma, his body language radiating comfort and ease. "Let's see what you've got so far," he said, leaning in to examine the half-formed project. And then, as though it were the most natural thing in the world, he began working on it. Not helping her, mind you, but actively working on it while she sat there, her pencil resting idly in her hand. The scene was almost surreal. Emma, clearly relieved to have been let off the hook, watched as her father brainstormed ideas, glued pieces together, and essentially took over the entire assignment. Her face was a mixture of gratitude and satisfaction, as though she had just been rescued from a perilous situation. My husband, on the other hand, looked pleased with himself, as though his actions were the epitome of good parenting. And I stood there, frozen in a cocktail of disbelief, anger, and despair. When I finally found my voice, it came out sharper than I intended, a whip crack of frustration that echoed through the room. "What are you doing?" I demanded, my eyes darting between him and the project that was now more his than Emma's. "She's supposed to be doing this herself." He didn't even look up, his focus entirely on the task at hand. "She's tired," he said, his tone casual, as though that simple fact justified his actions. "She can finish it in the morning." "But that's not the point," I shot back, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "She needs to learn responsibility. She needs to understand that actions, or in this case, inaction, have consequences." He finally looked at me then, his expression one of mild exasperation, as though I were the one being unreasonable. "You're being too hard on her," he said, his words tinged with reproach. "She's just a kid. Let her enjoy her childhood." It was as though a dam had burst inside me, all the pent-up frustration and resentment spilling out in a torrent of words I could no longer contain. "This isn't about ruining her childhood," I snapped. "This is about preparing her for the future." The real world doesn't work like this. No one is going to swoop in and do her work for her. No one is going to let her off the hook because she's tired. What you're teaching her isn't kindness, it's entitlement. He recoiled slightly, as though my words had physically struck him, but his resolve didn't waver. I just want her to be happy, he said, his voice softer now but no less firm. You're acting like a drill sergeant. She's going to look back on her childhood and only remember you being hard on her. And that was the moment I realized just how wide the chasm between us had grown. To him, my efforts to teach Emma responsibility and independence were nothing more than harshness, a misguided attempt to enforce discipline at the expense of joy. To me, his actions were a form of sabotage, undoing every lesson I tried to instill with a single well-meaning gesture. The rest of the night passed in a haze of silence. He retreated to the living room, and I stayed in our bedroom, the air between us thick with unspoken tension. Emma, oblivious to the storm brewing around her, went to bed with a smile on her face, her project mostly finished thanks to her father's intervention. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and wondering where we go from here. How do you bridge a gap like this? How do you parent as a team when you can't even agree on what parenting means? The explosion that had been simmering beneath the surface for months finally erupted. I lost it, and when I say I lost it, I mean every ounce of my composure crumbled under the weight of my frustration, anger, and sheer disbelief. I couldn't hold back anymore, not after watching him, yet again, sweep in and dismantle the lessons I'd been desperately trying to teach our daughter. My voice rose, sharp and cutting, slicing through the uneasy silence that had settled after he so effortlessly dismissed me. I told him, in no uncertain terms, that he was teaching Emma to be lazy, enabling her to believe that the world would always bend to her whims and that someone else would always clean up her messes or take responsibility for her failures. My words came out like rapid fire, each one laced with the frustration that had built up over years of feeling undermined. I didn't hold back. I told him that his constant babying wasn't an act of love, it was a disservice to her, one that would leave her ill-equipped to face the challenges of adulthood. She's never going to learn to do anything for herself if you keep treating her like she's helpless, I said, my voice trembling with the intensity of my emotions. He fired back just as fiercely, his defenses going up like a fortress under siege. He accused me of being too hard on her, too strict, too focused on rules and responsibilities. You're making her childhood miserable, he shot back, his words ringing in my ears. Do you even hear yourself? You're acting like a drill sergeant, barking orders and expecting perfection. She's just a kid. Let her be a kid. That comparison me, a drill sergeant, stung in a way I hadn't anticipated. I opened my mouth to respond, but he wasn't done. He went on to say that childhood should be a time of joy and freedom, not endless chores and lectures about responsibility. His voice was filled with passion, almost pleading, as if he genuinely believed that what he was doing was right, that he was the hero in this narrative, protecting our daughter from the harshness of the world. But all I could hear was the sound of him tearing down everything I had tried to build. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, teetering between rage and despair. You think I'm too hard on her? I said, my voice trembling but firm. You think I'm making her miserable? Do you know what's going to make her miserable? Growing up thinking the world owes her everything, only to find out that it doesn't. That's what you're setting her up for. And when she's 25 and can't hold down a job because she expects someone else to do all the hard work for her, or when she's 30 and still living at home because she doesn't know how to be independent, you're going to regret this. Not me. You. His face hardened at that, his jaw tightening as he crossed his arms over his chest. You're blowing this out of proportion, he said, his tone dismissive. She's not going to turn out like that. She's a good kid. She's smart and capable. You're acting like one project or one messy room is going to ruin her future. And you're acting like none of this matters, I countered, my voice growing louder as the frustration bubbled over. You're so busy being her best friend that you're forgetting to be her parent. This isn't just about one project or one messy room. It's about the pattern, the habits, the values we're supposed to be instilling in her. And right now, all she's learning is that she can coast through life and someone else will pick up the slack. His eyes narrowed, and I could see the anger simmering just below the surface. You think I don't care about her future? You think I'm not parenting her just because I don't do things your way? That's not fair. I want her to have a happy childhood. I want her to feel loved and supported. I don't want her to look back on this time and only remember being scolded and punished. And you think I don't want her to be happy? I shot back, incredulous. You think I'm doing this because I enjoy being the bad guy? I want her to have a happy childhood too, but happiness isn't about getting everything you want or never facing consequences. It's about learning and growing and becoming a person who can stand on their own 2 feet. And right now, you're robbing her of that. The room fell silent after that, the air between us thick with tension. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the way his emotions warred with his sense of pride. But instead of conceding, he shook his head and turned away, retreating to the living room without another word. The sound of the television flicking on echoed down the hallway, a clear signal that he wasn't ready to continue the conversation. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing with everything I wanted to say but couldn't. The anger and frustration were still there, simmering just beneath the surface, but now they were joined by something else, something heavier. Doubt. Had I gone too far? Had I let my emotions get the better of me? Was I being too harsh, too rigid in my expectations? I glanced down the hall toward Emma's room, where I knew she was probably oblivious to the storm that had just unfolded. Part of me wanted to go to her, to explain why I had reacted the way I did, to make her understand that everything I was doing was for her benefit. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I sank down onto the edge of the bed, my head in my hands, the weight of it all pressing down on me like a physical force. This wasn't just a disagreement between 2 parents. It was a fundamental clash of values, a battle over what it meant to raise a child in a world that was often unforgiving and unkind. And the worst part was, I wasn't even sure if I was in the right. All I knew was that something had to change because if it didn't, I wasn't sure how much more I could take. The house felt heavier in the days that followed, as though the walls themselves absorbed the tension and now pressed down on me from every angle. My husband barely spoke to me, his silence a weapon far more potent than any argument. Emma, caught in the crossfire, had aligned herself with him. She was upset with me because Daddy's mad, and that, in her 12-year-old world, was apparently my fault. Every glance she threw my way carried a trace of accusation, as if I had single-handedly disrupted the harmony of our home. I felt isolated, stranded in a place that should have felt like my sanctuary. The weight of doubt crept in, wrapping itself around my resolve and squeezing until I couldn't tell whether I was standing firm on principles or just being stubborn. Was I too harsh? Was I the villain in this story? These questions gnawed at me relentlessly, their sharp edges carving out chunks of my confidence. But every time I considered letting it go, conceding defeat for the sake of peace, I would think about the long-term consequences. I would imagine Emma at 16, demanding a car because Daddy always says yes. I would picture her at 20, struggling to navigate a world that doesn't hand out rewards for simply existing. I could see her at 25, unprepared for the demands of adulthood, blaming the world or worse, me for her unhappiness. That future haunted me far more than any argument or silent treatment ever could. Still, the current state of our family felt untenable. I couldn't go on like this, living in a house divided. So, I decided to take a step back and reflect, not to admit defeat, but to reassess my approach. I started reading parenting articles, listening to podcasts, and even reaching out to a close friend for advice. I needed clarity, a way to bridge the gap between my husband's leniency and my discipline without completely compromising my values. One evening, after days of silence, I approached my husband. He was sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone, the glow of the screen casting shadows on his tired face. I sat down beside him, careful to keep my tone soft, my words measured. "We need to talk," I began, and for the first time in days, he really looked at me. I told him how I felt, not in an accusatory way but in a way that laid bare my fears and intentions. I told him I understood his desire to make Emma's childhood magical, to shield her from disappointment and hardship. I told him I admired his love for her, how deeply he cared about her happiness. But I also explained my perspective that parenting wasn't just about the present moment but about preparing her for the future. I told him how scared I was that our approach, if left unchecked, would leave her unprepared for the realities of life. He listened. For the first time in a long time, he really listened. When I was finished, he sighed, his shoulders sagging as though the weight of his own doubts had finally caught up with him. I don't want her to feel unloved," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I grew up in a house where nothing was ever good enough, and I swore I'd never do that to my kid." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had always known his childhood wasn't perfect, but hearing it framed like that made me realize just how much his past had shaped his present. "I get that," I said, my voice softening. "But loving her doesn't mean giving her everything she wants or shielding her from every difficulty. Sometimes love means letting her struggle, letting her fail, so she can learn and grow." It wasn't an easy conversation, and it didn't end with a neatly tied bow of resolution. But it was a start. We agreed to work together, to find a balance between his nurturing instincts and my focus on responsibility. We decided to establish clear boundaries and rules that we would both enforce consistently. Most importantly, we promised to back each other up, even when we didn't fully agree in the moment. If we needed to discuss something, we would do it privately, away from Emma, so she wouldn't see us as divided. The first test of our new approach came sooner than I expected. Emma wanted a new pair of designer sneakers, expensive ones, the kind that made me wince just thinking about the price tag. She came to her father first, her tone sweet and persuasive, fully expecting him to cave. But to my surprise, he didn't. He told her she would need to save up for them, that she could earn some money by doing extra chores around the house. When she turned to me, hoping for a different answer, I repeated what her father had said. The look on her face was priceless, a mixture of shock, disbelief, and begrudging acceptance. It wasn't easy, and there were plenty of complaints along the way, but eventually, she did the work and got the shoes herself. The pride on her face when she finally wore them was worth every eye roll and dramatic sigh. Small victories like that gave me hope. They showed me that change was possible, that we could recalibrate our parenting dynamic without losing sight of what mattered most: our love for Emma and our commitment to raising her well. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of tension and disagreement, but we were learning, together, how to navigate the messy, complicated landscape of parenthood. As for Emma, she adapted better than I had expected. She didn't always like the new rules, but over time, she began to rise to the occasion. She started taking more responsibility for her actions, completing her projects without being reminded, and even offering to help around the house without being asked. Seeing her grow in that way reassured me that we were on the right path. Looking back now, I can see how easy it would have been to let things continue as they were, to avoid the conflict and keep the peace. But I'm glad I didn't. Parenting isn't about taking the easy road, it's about making the tough decisions, even when they're unpopular, because you know they're the right ones. And in the end, that's the kind of parent I want to be, the kind who loves fiercely, teaches patiently, and never stops striving to do what's best for her child, even when it's hard. So, am I the bad guy? Maybe sometimes. But if being the bad guy means raising a daughter who is kind, capable, and resilient, then I'll wear that title with pride. Because in the grand scheme of things, it's not about whether she remembers me as the fun parent or the strict one. It's about whether she grows up knowing she was loved enough to be guided, even when it wasn't easy. And for that, I'll never apologize.